ins and outs of Greenleaf.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Okay, so my first announcement, then we'll get to this story, is that, some of you know, organizing an American Literature Association symposium on Flannery O'Connor for Savannah to be held live and in person, no technology, June 17th to the 19th. And I've extended the deadline for people to talk to me about a presentation they want to give at this conference until March 26th, the day after. We'll still be talking about this on birthday until March 26th. Email me if you'd like to talk about presenting at that conference. The official title is Flannery O'Connor and Families, but we are open to papers on other topics, especially the topic of how to teach Flannery O'Connor these days. It's nice to see familiar faces out there and some new faces too. Okay, let's get to Greenleaf. It's basically the first story she wrote after she finished A Good Man Is Hard to Find in Other Stories. She was working on The Violent Bear It Away for a long stretch of time. But when she said, okay, there are going to be some more stories here too, this is the first one that ended up in her posthumous collection. So if you want to put a date on the story, it's basically early 1956. Where does this story come from? Well, on one hand, it's a story that's very much based in local life. You could easily imagine this story taking place at Andalusia Farm. Apparently there was a person who was gored to death by a bull on the farm that's next to Andalusia. Susan Lindsley has a discussion of these matters in one of her books. So in a way, it's very tied to reality. I mean, her personal life right here. And there'll be a couple of times today when I will probably compare this story to The Displaced Person, which I always imagined she was revising for her first story collection to finish that thing up almost as late as she was writing Good Country People. There are some interesting connections between The Displaced Person and this story and Greenleaf. And some of it is that it's set on the farm, but there are other things too. Okay, so I talked about how it's realistic and it's close to home. The other side to this is that this is a story that is filled with not just religious symbolism, we're used to that, but with mythology and allusions to all sorts of religious traditions. One story that I've heard so many times or repeated so many times that I'm sure it's true, even though I can't remember where I read this, maybe somebody else can pin this down, is that Carolyn Gordon, her mentor, once told Flannery O'Connor in the sweetest possible way, you don't know anything about mythology, so you really shouldn't try to write about it. And that this was part of Flannery's inspiration. Her teacher tells her she's got a lack, and so she writes a story that is filled with mythology. And this leads to all sorts of critical talk about how does the Christian imagery relate to the other imagery? Is Flannery putting Greek and Roman mythology up against Christianity and staging a war in between the lines of a story like this? Or is she trying to reconcile them? What is supposed to be the relationship between those two? The first page of the story says that the bull is Jesus. And then that's kind of repeated on a bunch of other pages of the story, subtly or not so subtly. But, you know, when your divine figure is a bull, you know, there's a lot of association that gets pulled into the story. And of course, you know, you can make the bull Christian. Let's say that first, and Flannery does. And if you Google bull in the Bible, you know, you get lots of Bible quotes that use the image of a bull to make this or that point. When you look at mythology, what most critics have done is to think about the story in relation to the myth of Europa and the bull. And I think Irene said, you said that you posted something somewhere, you know, kind of using that image. Okay. Zeus, what a guy, was constantly out to get women one way or another. And so in one instance, he wanted to have his way with a woman named Europa, and he transformed himself into a bull so that he could seduce her, carry her off. And this is supposed to be the myth that explains why we have Europe, because Zeus had his way with Europa. Oh, those Greeks. When you have this myth around for a long time, the myth takes on all kinds of associations, and I carry around with me, it's hard to put on display because I don't know technology, that there are versions of the myth, interpretations of the myth, where Europa wins. She's having a great time, and the bull may not be totally in control. He may not realize what he's gotten himself into by seducing this woman. I carry around for, you know, passing around in class a postcard of the painting called Europa by Titian that's in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. By all means, look for the Europa and the bull painting next time you're in Boston. And I would say Europa's having a great time. Bull, not so sure. There are lots of ways that you can interpret how that myth gets played, and I don't think Titian is the only one who's making the myth more complicated. There's more. As one of my students, Matthew Partain, you know, got a, you know, put in his response page for me earlier this semester.
Bruce, I put the link to Europa and the bull.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody can look at it. There's also the Minotaur. And it's hard to know how much of that story you want to hear today, but I think actually that the Minotaur has a little bit more to do with the Greenleaf bull than the bull that is Zeus. In the other myth, the Minotaur, I mean, that story, there's a woman named Pasiphae, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, and she sees this bull and she thinks it's Zeus because she's heard about the story of Europa and the bull. And so she wants that bull. And so she dresses up as a cow and has sex with the bull. Well, it's not Zeus, it's a bull. And so she gives birth to the Minotaur, part human, part bull. The Minotaur is a monster. Theseus comes along and eventually kills the Minotaur. To me, the interesting thing is the monster part of that story. The Minotaur is kept in the labyrinth. Remember the Minotaur in the labyrinth? And he eats people regularly. This is kind of the curse. He's always chewing away at young Athenians, apparently, for years before they get Theseus to solve the problem for him. And when I read the opening page or so of the story where Mrs. May hears chewing, 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 and she imagines that the house is being eaten, she's being eaten. Later she says that everything on the farm is being eaten, including the green leaves. I think this is more of a vision of the Minotaur, who's, you know, a kind of monster figure, not a divine figure. It's a little bit of a bunch of things. And, you know, there are other religious, spiritual traditions that have got bulls in them. And, you know, we don't have to go on into the list. I would just say, Flannery O'Connor could be something of a sponge for comparative religion. I mean, she knew what she believed and she knew what she was committed to, but that didn't keep her from being interested in a whole bunch of other stuff that's out there. And given her warning, you know, from Carolyn Gordon that she ought to stay away from mythology because she didn't know anything about it, you know, I think Flannery went as far as she could in saying, I can throw everything in the pot here and make this story be a Christian story and a bunch of other things too. So there, dear teacher. Now, I say that and I think, oh, that exhausts the topic of where this story comes from. And then, was it yesterday that Irene pointed out to me the short film that Ben Alexander just posted on the Facebook page, is that right, for the O'Connor Society. And he's talking about how he put together his book of, you know, his recent book of O'Connor letters, next to letters from other people, but mostly O'Connor letters. And he mentions just in passing that, of course, Greenleaf is a rewrite of Ernest Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon. Well, you know, why not, you know, make that comparison? Flannery did make her family rename the farm Andalusia, which is a name from Spain. And, you know, you could say that in some kind of metaphorical way, Greenleaf is a take on the bullfighting tradition. And how many things is, you know, do you want to throw into the mix of stuff that Flannery might have been thinking about, even as she's writing a story that's very close to home and about something that happened to somebody on the next farm, right here in town. It's quite a mix. Okay, now let's do a bit about name symbolism. It's irresistible with all O'Connor stories, I suppose, but with this one certainly too. Mrs. May.
You've gotten stuck. There you go.
Okay, Mrs. May. Is it just a coincidence that that's a spring, early summer rebirth of nature month? You know, in Milledgeville, May is like midsummer, but it you know, suggests rebirth, growth, springy things. It also happens to be the month of the sign of Taurus, the bull. What's that mean? That, you know, the bull and Mrs. May are associated that way? Are we talking about how she's fated to meet the bull in this story? Or what? You've also got the name Greenleaf in this story, which seems like another obvious nature reference, spring reference. The leaves are green, a rebirth, the new life of spring. Why does Mrs. May have a name that's kind of similar to the name Greenleaf when they are so at odds? One possible answer is, I'll just go ahead and run down the field. Mrs. May is going to turn into the Greenleafs by the end of the story on some wispy metaphorical way. And of course, you could look at the name Mrs. May and just say it's totally ironic that it's like the least appropriate name for Mrs. May, and that's why Flannery picked it. There's always that possibility that everything could be taken seriously, and then you can turn it upside down and say that's exactly the opposite of what that character's name ought to be. And while we're on that topic, let's think about Wesley and Schofield. Why in the world did Mrs. May name her boys for Protestant preacher types? I mean, yeah, she always wants to name her characters John Wesley to make fun of Methodism, I guess. She never got tired of that joke. But, you know, we're supposed to believe that Mrs. May picked the names of her children, right? Why would she pick that? For a long time, I looked at the name Schofield, and in my innocence, I just said, oh, you know, she's picking that name because he scoffs at the field. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the fields that surround the farm. He hates the farm operation. He wants to do something else totally. And then I found out, oh, he's an evangelical minister type who did his own work on the Bible and is kind of famous for it, and I was supposed to know that. I have a really difficult time connecting the dots between that character and that historical figure. It seems to me that might just be, let's see how inappropriate a name I can give to a character. Mrs. May is fairly famous for that line about how she had respect for religion, even though she didn't think any of it was true. Remember that line? You know, if you're that kind of person, that cause you to name your boys Wesley and Schofield? What's the psychology of that? See, I'm talking about things I don't understand. Okay. If anybody wants to jump in there with an explanation for these things, you just go right ahead, folks. Okay, now let's talk about OT and TET, which I give up on totally. Anybody who wants to come up with a theory about why these names make sense, you got me. You know, of course, I see OT and I think, oh, Old Testament. Somehow I've got to find out that ET stands for New Testament. And I keep waiting for somebody to come explain to me that ET somehow refers to the New Testament. No, still haven't heard it. You know, I've been asking people to come up with some clever explanation. These are two of the most uncanny, vague characters she ever created. I mean, this isn't typical O'Connor characterization. We never see them, we just hear about them. You know, everybody in this story's got an opinion about OT and ET. They could be, you know, they're kind of uncanny in the sense of being twins, and there's a long tradition of twins as being a little peculiar somehow, a little out of the ordinary somehow. They could be wonderful, you know, they could be ideal. They're going to inherit the earth. They're poor folk who are going to become rich. They're going to become society. They have a wonderful farming operation. Mrs. May is totally envious, shocked to be so envious when she sees what their dairy barn looks like when she sneaks in on it. These characters are symbols, examples of how the world is how America is changing after World War II. These are the sorts of people who are going to prosper. And there are all these reasons to think these are the people that Flannery O'Connor and her mother saw as the kind of people who are going to displace people like the O'Connors. They're going to take over the world. We're going to be nobodies here pretty soon. That they probably had feelings about, you know, some of the local workers that Mrs. May is having about OT and ET. And then on the other hand, are OT and ET really so great? I don't know. They're puzzles. Mrs. May talks about how ungrateful they are. She's been nice to them in this way, and 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 yet they let their bull get away, and they know it's messing with her farm operation, and they don't care. And she hears third hand, oh, you just go ahead and kill that bull for us. Well, it doesn't seem to me that's, you know, being a good neighbor. And they're mysterious. And the puzzle of OT and ET, I don't think anybody has ever solved. It just makes me more interested in the details about OT and ET. There are little indications in the story that they really are as good as anybody thinks they are, you know, that they're just so ideal that we can't even talk about them very much because it's hard to write about people who do things right, especially in Flannery O'Connor land. Okay, I'll stop with OT and ET. There, you know, that's an ongoing puzzle in the story. If you think O'Connor doesn't like technology, what do you do about OT and ET and their perfect farm operation? They do everything right. You know, they're not doing old-fashioned farming. They're doing newfangled farming, and that's going to win out over people like Mrs. May. They are the New South. Most of the time, my easy generalization is Flannery O'Connor is always on the side of the poor, the people who are going to take over the world, who are going to change the South after World War II. That's always, always, always better than what came before. But you know, it's kind of hard to know how far to push that with these guys. Mm-hmm.
Cheryl and Heidi are both engaging in some speculation in the chat.
Yeah, y'all go ahead and talk about that. Extraterrestrial. I thought about that. He's from outer space. He's not real. Okay, they're twins. ET could stand for Early Testament. That means that they're the same. They just look like they're different. Is the Old Testament ever referred to as the Early Testament? I've never heard it called that. You know, there are times when I contemplate this question and I say, Flannery has had so much fun with us putting symbolic names on things that I wouldn't put it past her to say, I will just pick some letters at random and drive English teachers crazy for, you know, the rest of time as they are, you know, insist that they can find meaning in any possible name I give to anybody. Okay, and then the other comment that's on here, I don't know if everybody's looking at chat. Heidi suggests May. Could be a verb, of course. Mrs. May might be saying, you may do whatever you want, right? And she does give a lot of permission. And I would say, yes, I'd go so far as to say she gives the bull permission to gore her to death. You know, that I go into classroom, you know, and I'm trying to wake everybody up with wild claims. And so I just say, hey, Mrs. May wants to be gored by the bull. This is a happy ending we have in this story. She's wanted this all along. She's done everything she could think of to do to cause the ending that she's got to her this story. You notice that Mrs. May is like a short story writer all the way through the story. She's imagining conversations she might have with the other people on the farm. She's thinking about how her life is like the plot of a story and how it might turn out. She's constantly like playing Flannery O'Connor and allowing a lot. So I would definitely say, you know, if you can take an O'Connor name, I mean, I would just say this in general, if you can take the name that's on an O'Connor character and you can turn it into different parts of speech, I think Flannery did that. She thought about it that way and thought, okay, there can be more going on with name symbolism. And okay.
Bruce, I would also say from my perspective, ET and OT are kind of ciphers, but they exist to show up Wesley and Schofield.
Well, sure. The you know, you've even if they're ciphers, the story just says over and over and over that one thing that Mr. Greenleaf and Mrs. May really agree on is, you know, OT and ET are better than Wesley and Schofield. One of whom is an intellectual and a teacher, and you can't get any worse than that, right? And Schofield sells insurance, you know, exploitative insurance for Black people. You know, little sidebar here. I have seen complaints about the story as being inconsistent because at one point in the story, Mrs. May says she doesn't have insurance. And then later in the story, she says she's okay because she's got insurance. And I've seen people talk about that as gotcha, you know, that, oh, Flannery wasn't keeping track of what she was writing. No. I think the explanation is she bought insurance halfway through the story, okay? To me, the significance of this really is she never talked to Schofield about it. You know, we don't have that scene where she asks for advice. It's just mentioned in passing that her son sells insurance and probably knows insurance and could sell all kinds of insurance if she wanted to, but she's not going to him to buy insurance on this farm. She's probably ignoring him. Doesn't want to get close enough to her own son to have that conversation. Am I overstating that? Okay, we had another
Susan
comment.
has just added something.
Susan,
Susan, do you want to join the conversation?
Let Susan talk. Where's Susan?
You have to unmute
Where's
yourself, Susan.
Yeah,
There you go.
My comment was simply that Mrs. May, in her imperious manner, does not ever appear to consider the opinions of anyone else, and so I can't see that reference, and it's being used as a verb.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. So, but you can still say she tells herself that she may do anything she wants and she doesn't need anybody else's permission, you know, to do things. That it could be totally self-directed. I may do whatever I want. That may be for her.
Well, again, my
name.
difference is I don't think she thinks that way in saying I may. I think she thinks in terms of I will. And there's an agency in will that is lacking in may.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh, Linda has something to add.
Oh, yeah,
too.
go ahead.
You're gonna have to unmute me, Linda. You're still muted.
Yeah.
I found that Miss May has real ambivalence about which two boys should have ended up as her sons. Early on in the story, she says, and you two, talking to Wesley and Schofield, she says, and you two should have belonged to that woman, meaning Mrs. Mayfield, who she had no regard for and
Greenleaf.
thought her slovenly and horrible. And then later on in the story, the two boys are saying, one says to the other, well, neither you nor me is her boy. And I've been trying to figure out, is Flannery O'Connor trying to tell us something about, I have no idea, maybe some mixed boundaries in that story. They're not sure they have the right children, or the children aren't sure they're with the right parent. I don't know what that means, but I found that part interesting, and she said it more than once.
Right.
I don't know how other people would see that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, my habit with dealing with that kind of problem in the story is to talk about my substitute child thing, that lots of parents go looking for other people that they can treat like children and be very nice to, as if they were trying to prove to their biological children, see, I'm really a great parent. I just need somebody who's a better child than you are. So that there's this game being played all the time between parents and children in O'Connor. And, that might have something to do with all the places in the story where there's conversation about who deserves which children or which children go with which parents. And she's even got her sons playing along. They're firing back at her and saying, yeah, we'd be better off with another mother. And I will let somebody else theorize about substitute parents. I've had that pointed out to me, that I have blinders on about that theme in O'Connor, and I think I probably do. There's another comment that's in the chat, which was something that I was just about to forget to bring up. I read a passage in one of Flannery's letters to A, where she was working on a story about a woman being gored by a bull, but she didn't know how Flannery would get there. Yeah, I mean, this is a nice corrective to all this talking that I've mostly done about all the mythological stuff that might be going on in the story and all the religious significance that might be going on in the story. In that letter to A, you can find it fairly easy in the index if you just look at all the pages that say she's talking about Greenleaf. Flannery says, I'm working on this story, I'm working on this story, I'm working on this story. And the problem is, it's not that I can't figure out my theology. She says, I don't know how I'm going to get that horn into that woman's chest. And, she's very practical and very writerly. This is creative writing class. A lot of the work is, how are you going to make it believable that your ending is the ending? You want the ending of the story to be a surprise, but you don't want your reader to dismiss it and say, well, that's phony. That couldn't possibly happen. You have to walk a tightrope. You have to say, okay, there are some things that suggest that we're headed towards this ending all the way through the story. And you still want it to be a surprise. You don't want to make it like inevitable that this is going to be the ending of the story. I sometimes go so far as to say that Flannery's solution to this problem was that she made her main character want to be gored by a bull, and started working that into the story. And I know from experience that my saying that in the classroom can be very irritating to people. I have inspired a fair number of good research papers where people are determined to prove me totally wrong about that. The one that sticks in my head is a research paper by James Owens, in which he talks about the bull as God's scourge come to punish the evil, unredeemably evil, bad Mrs. May. And Jim has so much fun looking at this story that way that I, at a certain point, I just kind of back off and say, this is a short story that supports many meanings. I mean, many interpretations. This is part of my definition of literature, is that, it should support a variety of conflicting meanings, or else what good is it? Please pick the version of the story that works for you. And you know, I have the things in the story that puzzle me, but I'm pretty comfortable looking at the story the way I do, and I realize that some people want to look at it in a very different way. They love to see the whole universe out to get Mrs. May for her attitudes all the way through the story. And there are pleasures in that outlook. Okay. Let's see, where shall we go now? This is a story about sex and religion. Okay. I think one of Flannery's polite knocks on Protestantism is that Protestants think sex is dirty. And so she wants to prove that she's open-minded about connecting sex and religion. Oh, Jesus stabbed me in the heart. Well, yeah, it's in the heart, but it's more than that, I think. And I'm rather glad there isn't a film version of Greenleaf yet. You know, it could be really hard to watch the end of this story. I'm quite comfortable visualizing the ending as I read it and just giving myself as much graphic stuff as I can stand, and then I stop. There's an interesting exchange that took place, and again, I can't remember where I read this, one of the collections of letters, or maybe it was in one of the biographies. Carolyn Gordon, who was a recent convert to Catholicism, scolded the O'Connors one time because of the way they were running their farm operation. I bet a lot of you have heard this story. And she said, you know, a good Catholic should not use artificial insemination to breed cattle.
We have some beef farmers here, and they are laughing their heads off.
Well, Carolyn Gordon found a way to bring Flannery and Regina together for, you know, a few moments there, that they said, you're taking your Catholicism too far. Cows are not people. You can't run a farm without paying attention to the genetics of your cattle and what OT and ET do, letting their cow get away and not caring when he strays onto Mrs. May's farm. Yeah, this is a bad, impolite thing to do, and it is going to mess up the farm operation, and you can't run your farm operation that way, and the O'Connors would agree. I can't imagine that Flannery thought about this story without remembering this confrontation she had with Carolyn Gordon, who was, you know, kind of telling the O'Connors how to be Catholic. What gall, you know, you would say to that. And I talked to Dory Nelligan one time, who was a friend of the O'Connors, and she had a dairy farm, and she assured me once, and of course she's talking about recent years, that they had in their computer all the data about the genetics of every cow, every bull that was wandering around on the farm. There was nothing, you know, as little as possible left to chance, and that was the only way to do it. Dory sounded like she thought it was a little much, that it was kind of oppressive to have to know so much about the genes of cattle, but you know, she was sure that it was very important to, you know, running a farm. Okay, what else? I would say, how are we doing? We're happy to get more questions here. Oh, here's a question. Would Flannery's mother have recognized anything of herself in Mrs. May? Boy, that's a good one. This is a question for me to ask the panelists on the 25th, right? 6 o'clock, I'll ask these other people. So is Mrs. May Regina? You know, there are 4 there are 4 mothers in O'Connor who get killed at the end of the story. And I think 3 of the 4 are living on farms. So Mrs. May is one of the candidates for a character who shows Flannery thinking it's fun to kill off her mother. I mean, this is where it might be most explicit. You know, and some people may have other insights into this matter about what was Regina thinking about all this stuff. What I've picked up over the years is that Regina did pay attention some to what Flannery was writing. You know, she sometimes read stories. Flannery would talk about how her mother fell asleep over O'Connor's fiction. Maybe she wrote to try to keep Mama awake. That's hard to believe, somebody falling asleep over reading Flannery O'Connor stories. That's an interesting mother-daughter dynamic, that she could read these stories and fall asleep over. I think she probably said, well, this isn't really about me. And that was probably an unusual but healthy response to the situation. And then, bless her, Regina just kept right on running that farm and paying the bills so that her daughter, who loved fantasizing about killing her, could continue to crank out these stories and become famous. You know, Flannery wasn't paying a lot of the bills. It was Regina who was responsible for keeping their household going. So I think she had to realize that my daughter's making fun of me. But, you know, for her own sanity, it seems to me she just kind of said, well, up to a point, it's kind of like me. But no, she's not really writing about me. And how else could you maintain any peace in the household? I think when you look at more details of the relationship between Regina and Flannery, you get more and more indications of tension between them, and that Regina would occasionally say something. You know, this is true of every relationship, isn't it? She would occasionally say things that were kind of obviously attempts to irritate her daughter. My favorite quote that's on display at Andalusia right now as part of the show that Megan Anderson put together is the one where Regina says to Flannery, "Don't you think God wants you to write something that a lot of people will like?" You know, and I don't like your writing, and God doesn't like your writing, and one little offhand comment, you know, what would be better for sending Flannery into orbit than a statement like that? You know, Regina apparently more than once said, "Why don't you write something good like Gone with the Wind?" There was an extra on the documentary Flannery about how Flannery felt about Gone with the Wind. This was a little piece of the tension, and so I think factor that into that question about, you know, how did Regina feel about the fiction? I think she thought it was, you know, a little perverse, a little too unlikable, you know, too artsy, not written for normal people like Regina, and that Flannery could make it more pleasant, and that would be a, you know, and that would be a good thing, and there was something wrong with her if she didn't want to do that. And but I still think Regina had to have filtered, you know, some of it out. Okay, that's maybe more than enough. My last comment, and if we'll see if anybody else has any other questions or comments. At the end of The Displaced Person, which I think Flannery was writing reworking not that long before she started Greenleaf. Displaced Person got rewritten for A Good Man Is Hard to Find in Other Stories, and then Greenleaf is, written shortly thereafter, even though it ended up in a book that was published quite a few years later. At the end of The Displaced Person, also set on the farm, we see a woman who owns a farm take no action. She stands there and she just watches a death, right? And it's a terrible thing that she can't take action. She can't even say to Mr. Gujak, move out of the way of that big, powerful force that is about to kill you. Sound familiar? At the end of Greenleaf, she doesn't take any action. She does just the opposite. She gets out of the car and she goes and sits on the front bumper where she's been told, the bull is likely to head. He's rammed a car before on its front bumper. And she stands there and the bull comes out of the woods and he's a long way away. She's got lots of warning that bull is coming for her. And what happens is she does nothing. Seemingly, it's like two stories that end with inaction by one of these farm wives. I don't think anybody would look at Regina O'Connor and say this was somebody who didn't take action. It seems to me she was energy all the time in every way in everybody's business and telling everybody what they should do next and working hard all day long. But Flannery seems to be really interested in the significance of inaction. And in a way, I think I can read these two stories as having opposite takes on inaction. But it's very different when your inaction causes somebody else to be killed. That's very different from the significance of you end up getting killed because of your own inaction. I can kind of see a happy ending to Greenleaf, gory as it is, in a way that it's hard to see a happy ending at the end of The Displaced Person.
Heidi has an interesting comment that kind of
Yeah.
dovetails off of what you
Right.
just said.
Yeah, you want to say it, Heidi?
Sure. I guess it was also in a letter to A that I really enjoyed what she wrote about Greenleaf and whether this was about purgation, which would be, I believe, in the context of the Roman Catholic doctrine of spiritual cleansing of the soul, but then also trying to think about that she could see herself either identified with Mrs. May or with the bull. So just trying to reconcile that with Mrs. May being the mother, but is it her and where that all goes? So.
Yeah. So Flannery could see herself in Mrs. May. She could see her mother in Mrs. May. But the really interesting part of that is that she can look at the bull and say, oh, that's me. That's a possibility. Would any of us have the nerve to say that if Flannery didn't? We're going to look at this story and we're going to say, oh, well, Flannery is the bull out to kill her characters. Well, yeah, I guess I can have read things like that over the years, that Flannery loves killing people. And so, whatever is the force that, we've read things that say Flannery O'Connor is the misfit and A Good Man Is Hard to Find. John Hawkes in his famous essay, Flannery O'Connor's Devil, says that Flannery's working for the devil because she has such a good time tearing her characters to shreds. Here's Flannery kind of on the same wavelength, saying, I am the force that, kills people in this story. She might as well say she's the tractor in The Displaced Person that's, running over people and crushing them to how how far do you want to take this? I'm not sure. There's some people who say the violence in O'Connor is only really violence up to a certain point, and then it kind of turns into not real violence. It turns into something of a cartoon, and we don't have to take it quite as seriously as if we actually saw somebody being killed in our presence. And I can see that. You know, when I watch the next movie that we get from Netflix, there are times when I see violent scenes, and I do have that reaction. I can't take this. Give me something mild like Flannery O'Connor, which surprises me because I think of her as a very, you know, a writer who uses violence, 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 and grotesquerie, grotesquerie, grotesquerie all the time. And then I find that, you know, the next film that might come in the mail could have scenes that I just can't quite take. And I guess the best answer is because O'Connor does violence right. She makes it meaningful, not just gratuitous and for shock effect. And you know, that's an ongoing puzzle for me. Why do I like Flannery O'Connor's violence so much when I don't particularly like to watch violent movies? If you tell me a movie is violent, I'm going to say, well, I can probably live without seeing that one. And yet then I turn around and I reconsider this next story by Flannery O'Connor. That just happens all the time. What else have we got to say about this? Patricia Yeager, I mean, I probably should bring her up. Oh, Mary, what do you want to say?
Mary Janice? Yeah.
Bruce, if in the beginning you were talking about the bull maybe being Jesus, that was the crown of thorns and the bush. What happens to the bull in the end? Has he changed persona, or is Jesus being violent and punishing her? I mean, I would think there would be a consistency there with that imagery.
Well, he's a wild, tormented lover on the last page, burying his head in her lap, and he was a country suitor on page 1. One way to read it is that Jesus is this wild, dangerous, bad boy lover, and that the whole story is consistently about how a lady like Mrs. May finds that more and more attractive, so she finally gives herself over to it totally on the last page. Now, you know, there are some people who would reasonably have a problem with saying, you know, this is a story where Jesus is a highly sexualized killer. And, you know, they want to shift into saying, oh, well, that's the Zeus side of the bull. That's talking about something other than the real Jesus there. I think part of Flannery's Catholicism is that it gave her permission to just play with the significance of things in all sorts of, you know, kind of shocking ways. So I don't particularly see a big change. You know, that would be another interesting way to look at the story. If you say, you know, our major symbol is changing all the way through the story, and that what the bull means at the end is very different from what the bull means at the beginning. At the end, he's described as the sun, and he's described as a bullet. Now, how do you reconcile those things? A bull is, well, maybe they're both dangerous. You know, Flannery had lupus, and you can't spend much time out in the sun if you've got lupus, because it's going to do you harm. And the bullet doesn't seem like a positive image, no matter what. That bull is dangerous. But even on the first page, you know, her opening fantasy about the bull is that he's eating the house, eating her. You know, that he's this Minotaur monster eating everybody. There's a kind of consistency. I don't know if Mrs. May ever thinks the bull is Jesus. Maybe that's what we should just agree on, is that we're getting this commentary from the story. Think of the bull as Jesus. Think of the bull as Jesus. I don't know what does Mrs. May ever consciously take that seriously? She hears Mrs. Greenleaf say, "Oh, Jesus stabbed me in the heart. That's what I want. That would be the best thing." Is Mrs. May capable of saying, "Oh, yes, Mrs. Greenleaf has got a good idea here. I will go ask Jesus to stab me in the heart as he, the way Mrs. Greenleaf wants." That seems a little too much to ask from the story. Maybe I should go here to try to get myself out of the corner I'm painting myself into. I think that Flannery O'Connor characters, you ask them what they believe, they never know, and if they do know, they don't tell the truth. You want to find out what's going on inside a Flannery O'Connor character. You got to peel away a whole bunch of layers, and what's deep down inside, call it the unconscious, call it the subconscious, call it the soul, call it, something other than the conscious mind. That truth is very hard to find and generally hidden from the character's mind, and much more interesting. Mrs. May, in and of herself, is not a particularly interesting person, but her inner drives, her secrets, wow, that's really fascinating stuff. I'll never get tired of thinking about what's really going on with Mrs. May that she doesn't even realize is going on with Mrs. May. I would say in the course of this story, she is making the bull into a god that maybe she didn't think he was on page 1 of the story she's composing. Insofar as she's writing her own story here, I think she just saw him as a threat, and by the end of the story, she sees him as something more than he was at the beginning. Oh, I'm so glad I made myself say that. That may sound like horse hockey to you, but that bit sounds good to me. I always think that the conscious mind lies to us in O'Connor.
I would expect something that, from what I know of Flannery O'Connor, that she would have made it, that if that were God in the end, he wouldn't have been violent.
He wouldn't have been violent.
No. It just seems inconsistent with what I think of as, Catholicism. I mean, he died with the thorns and on the cross, but the bull is an aggressor and a killer.
Yeah.
Consistent with the idea that he's a symbol of Jesus.
Okay. So, let's just see how far you can push me. I will say Flannery O'Connor would not allow her orthodoxy to stand in the way of writing a story the way she thought would make a really good story.
Okay.
And she was orthodox, but as soon as she sat down at the typewriter and she's in the middle of a story and she says, "This bull is going to gore this woman on the last page," and I think she did know that was where this was going to end up. She was going to do whatever made that last page happen. And there are times in O'Connor where, she has things happen and she implies things that I cannot reconcile with what I read in the Catholic Encyclopedia. And I think, well, she knows her Catholicism, and she was totally committed. And then there's fiction writing, and I think sometimes they diverge. And she always did what she thought was best for the story. And she was confident enough in her faith, and she says, nobody's going to be damned because they interpret this bull in this story as a highly sexualized murderer. That's not going to ruin somebody's life that I'm writing the story this way. But how you make this really orthodox. A lot of people like to quote from the John Donne poem, "Batter My Heart, Three-Person God," where he's calling on God to rape him. Metaphysical poetry, 17th century. and they say, oh, that's just like Flannery O'Connor. You know, so this idea has been around. Rape me, rape me, rape me. Oh God, you know, this is an image of salvation. Well, take your pick. You know, which which interpretation you put on literature works for you. And this story opens a can of worms, and then, you know, opens another can of worms, and opens another can of worms. And I think it's a really great story, partly because it resists our ability to feel like we've answered all the questions. Whenever I talk about it, I feel like I'm always about to say something really wrong and stupid, and I go ahead and do it. You can tell. But you know, you have to play around with, you know, kind of wild ideas about this story to make sure you're taking in as much of the story as you can, and then maybe you calm down.
Susan has a really interesting, and Andy too, have interesting takes in the chat room there.
What is the connection between violence in the novels and the nastiness of her characters? I don't know. Maybe somebody else wants to talk about this. Maybe Susan wants to answer that question. I think it's all of a piece. I see nastiness and violence all over the place, and I think of it as consistent. And okay, and then you can say Grace is violent. Sure, that's a standard answer to, you know, why is there so much violence? Because Flannery likes the idea that especially Grace can be very violent because it turns your world inside out and upside down, and that it's rhetorical. You know, she's trying to get through to a totally secular audience and say, take a religious principle seriously. And her, you know, she could decide her best strategy for getting the secular world to think Grace is interesting would be to make it violent and bloody and gory, you know, that would wake up that audience. And look what her effect has been on Hollywood. You know, you've got all these Hollywood people who pay a lot of attention to Flannery O'Connor because it's like, oh, she's going to teach us how to use violence, violence, violence. I don't know that they all learn the lesson about making the violence meaningful. And, you know, and having Grace be involved in there somewhere. But, you know, that's part of the reason that she's been influential on a lot of pop culture. Let me throw this back at Susan. Did you have a notion about the answer to your own question about connecting violence in the novels and character nastiness?
Well, the only thing that I could really contribute to that is that she seems not to care very much about what the reader might think about her characters. You know, the reader can read about the grandmother in the car, you know, that gets killed at the end and not feel a whole lot of sympathy for her. Mm-hmm. Just as one can read about Mrs. May and not feel sympathy for a horrible end. And she had to be completely aware of that these were characters that could not move the hearts of her reader.
Mm. Mm.
Does that require violence on Flannery O'Connor's part to us as readers?
Well, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I think there's an ongoing thing about how Flannery regards her characters and how she regards us and how she thinks we're going to regard the characters. And you'd like to think we're all on the same page, and we're probably not. If you never feel insulted by a Flannery O'Connor story, you're probably missing something. That, you know, sometimes I think she wants us to say, oh, I'm a stupid idiot. I didn't notice what's going on for the last 40 years of looking at this story. And I've had the pleasure of having that experience and thinking, that's the sort of thing Flannery O'Connor does, is, you know, tell me that I'm wrong, that I don't see what's going on with the characters. And part of the violence is directed at me. Part of the direct violence is directed at Flannery too. You know, she's out to get herself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
one of the things it seems to me that a number of writers take into consideration is the presence of empathy and trying to make a connection with an audience through the use of empathy. And Flannery O'Connor seems not to consider that at all in her stories, which in a way is admirable.
Yes. I mean, there are lots of people who see this as the major problem that they have with reading O'Connor, is that it's not particularly loving. And I don't know what it says about me that doesn't seem like such a problem. I mean, to some extent, I think I can see a kind of love in O'Connor. It's totally unsentimental. It's totally earned when it, you know, rears its head. Oh my God, somebody feels good about somebody else, you know, has a good thought towards somebody else. What a shocker. It seems real when it happens, but there isn't much of it, you know, and that's an ongoing debate. Why do we let Flannery O'Connor get away with being so seemingly harsh towards her characters and us and herself? Where is the love? Where's the love? Where's the love? I get so many doses of love from the rest of popular culture and everything that surrounds me, and I find most of it phony and irritating, so that it's always refreshing to go back to O'Connor. But you know, I don't particularly want to have an argument with somebody who looks at O'Connor and says, this just isn't for me. It does not fulfill my needs. And there are plenty of people out there who say, no, this is not quite the thing. I see that we're out of time. I see that Harriet Pollack is here, and I've been saying to myself that if Harriet Pollack showed up here today, I was going to ask her, are you willing to take a question, Harriet? What does a Welty scholar say about a story like this that has so much mythology in it, of the sort that I think of Eudora Welty as being very comfortable with? I don't know. Does this make you want to compare Flannery O'Connor to Eudora Welty? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I was only going to say not particularly, but but now that you've got me thinking about it, I'll think about it some.
Well, I get asked every once in a while, why don't we compare Flannery O'Connor to Eudora Welty more often? And I have no good answer for that. I mean, I can think of Welty stories that are kind of like Flannery O'Connor stories. But, you know, there's that story about Eudora Welty teaching a class one time and trying to teach a Flannery O'Connor story, and she just throws up her hands and says, is there a Catholic in the room who can explain what in the world's going on in this story? I just don't get this. And that sticks in my head as a sign that we don't have to lump all Southern writers into the same category. It might not serve them. It just seems like a bit of a puzzle. Why don't we connect the dots between those two, or make them comment on each other more often than we do? It seems to me it's very rare that anybody tries to talk about them in relation to each other. Okay, a project for another time, I guess. Thank you all very much. We have run way over, and Irene didn't pull the plug on me, and so I'm still yakking at you. And thank you very much, and we'll see you next month for, I believe it's The Comforts of Home.
Okay.
And about the same time next month. And anybody wants to talk in Savannah in June, you get in touch with me. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.